Welcome to the Blizzcon PvP panel. Let's talk about kicking ass. Alright, so first I'm going to go through some of our PvP philosophy really quickly. Some of the things we talk about here is that we want to support a lot of different types of PvP. What we've come to learn over time is that PvP isn't just a singular thing. It's not just running around outdoor in the world and jacking people that are trying to do quests. So what we have is we have support for Battlegrounds, Outdoor World PvP, and arenas. And they really all have very different roles within our overall kind of total PvP package. Another one of our core philosophies is that PvP should be fun for everybody, not just the hardcore. I think a lot of times games tend to veer this particular part of the game toward the hardcore more and more. But it's really important to make sure there are elements of it that are very accessible, that get people interested and into it. Because if you figure that players at the very high level, if they're constantly dominating other players that are either lower level, lesser geared, less experienced, etc., it's going to really kind of keep them from ever becoming interested in PvP and getting involved. However, that being said, the hardcore should have a place to shine. Inherently, since PvP is competitive against other players, it's one of those areas of the game where it makes a lot of sense to be able to make sure that players can really separate themselves. Allow those really hardcore players that are really talented, really good at the game, that are really into PvP to be able to stand out and say, look, we're top dogs here. In addition, players should be able to compete in PvP, usually using primarily PvP rewards if they so choose. Now that is, I make sure to say the word primarily because I don't want to entirely discourage players at PvP from doing other elements of the game. I actually feel as though the game is stronger overall if players take part in a lot of different things, professions, raiding, dungeons, heroics, etc., etc. But we do want to make sure that your primary play, if you're a hardcore PvPer doing a lot of PvP, that most of your stuff comes from the PvP system. So first we're going to talk about Battlegrounds. We're going to cover, like I mentioned, we're going to cover Battlegrounds, we're going to cover Outdoor World PvP, and we're going to cover arenas. But Battlegrounds are going to be up first. So our philosophy here is that we want Battlegrounds to be a destination for rewarding, objective-based team PvP. This is something that we talked about a little bit at the last Blizzcon. It still holds true. We want to make sure that Battlegrounds are this place where you can have a PvP experience where everybody there that's participating is into the PvP. That's what they're there for. You know that it will have a clear-cut beginning and end, so there's going to be some sort of resolution. And you know that it's going to, because it's going to be objective-driven, you're going to have that sense of what you're supposed to be doing, and you're also going to have that sense of closure. You're going to know, okay, we did this stuff, we took these objectives, we won. Next, we want Battlegrounds to reinforce the Horde versus Alliance theme. We feel as though Battlegrounds are pretty tied into the overall feel of the World of Warcraft, the whole struggle between the Horde and Alliance. And this is one of the reasons that we haven't, allowed Horde to play against other Horde in Battlegrounds or Alliance against other Alliance. We want to make sure that Battlegrounds are very much about the war between the Horde and the Alliance, that really kind of that constant struggle, the constant tension that's going on. One of our early philosophies that we'll talk about a little bit more in the creation of the Arathi Basin Battleground is that Warcraft 3 meets Battlefield 1942. This was kind of the very original driving philosophy for how World of Warcraft PvP would work. Those were, two games that a lot of people at the office were playing, and obviously Warcraft 3 was one that we made. So to us, we wanted to capture kind of some of the best elements of those two games and turn that into our basic PvP model. In addition, Battlegrounds need to complement the existing game world. It's important to us that Battlegrounds feel like they are situated in the same kind of environments as our game world. Even though, of course, the Battlegrounds, for the most part, have a more kind of gamey setup that's conducive to PvP and objectives, etc. It's still important for us to make sure that these Battlegrounds feel like they have something to do with the way they're somewhat cohesive with the rest of the world. So that's why we have Arathi Basin using kind of tile sets from the Arathi Highlands. We've got Altrak Valley using that same sort of tile set. We want these to feel like, okay, these are kind of natural extensions of the game. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff, and he's going to talk about the kind of process of development of some of the Battlegrounds we have.
How's it going, everyone? Before I start on Altrak Valley, I'd like a quick show of hands. How many of you are actually playing Altrak Valley right now? AFK in the cave. Okay. Like Frank said, you're all banned. No, I'm just kidding. Altrak Valley, we touched upon this at our last BlizzCon, but we wanted to talk about some of this again. Originally, it was supposed to be a non-instance persistent zone. And there was a number of reasons why this didn't work out at the time, but we're very excited with Wrath of the Lich King, with Lake Wintergrass, to finally be able to revisit that concept. But a lot of what you were seeing in Altrak Valley at the time that it came out, especially in the earliest versions, were lots of quests and NPCs. They were there to provide content for when PvP was not going on. So that's kind of the history of how Altrak Valley came about. Due to various demand and balance constraints, we ultimately had to instance Altrak Valley. So over time, we've been slowly correcting some of the issues in the battleground. And Tom's going to talk a little bit more about the corrections in a second. I'm going to talk about what we learned from Altrak Valley. And this is more what we learned from the current version of Altrak Valley. I probably could do one of these presentations about every 3 months, and it would be different points. So map differences are cool, but it puts balance into question. So one thing that people have talked about is just make the map symmetrical. But one of the cool, distinct things about Altrak Valley is it's not a perfectly symmetrical map. Obviously, this has led to a few problems. Anybody who's encountered the bridge on the Alliance side, depending which side you're playing on, it's either the greatest thing ever or the dumbest thing ever. So that's one issue right there. The map also sort of forces, whether people recognize it or not, it's not that the Alliance is well coordinated and awesome at defense. It's that you keep killing them and forcing them to play defense. And therefore, they win a lot more often. And there's some other issues too, as far as NPC balance, that Tom will get into later. And we're making a lot of corrections, so we're excited about that. Players will AFK. This is happening for a number of reasons. The number one reason is because they can, and they can get good honor for doing it. That's going to be fixed. Honor is liberally awarded simply for being there. We've all had those cases of, you know, a loss in AV is often more rewarding than a win in one of the other battlegrounds, and that's obviously a problem, and we need to fix the numbers behind that. We need to make people want to win Altrak Valley. Believe it or not, the Horde can win Altrak Valley. It's just kind of easier for everyone if they don't right now, so. I know, it sucks, but NPCs can be interesting. We like the NPC interaction in Altrak Valley, but it's a little quirky right now. And what I'm referring to are the War Masters who show up on the Horde side, and some of the interesting pulling mechanics, and then of course the creative Vandar Stormpike solo pull, which that's another issue that, you know, we can't just fix one of these issues, we need to kind of fix them all at the same time, and that's our hope. So that's what we learned from Altrak Valley. The second battleground that we worked on was Warsong Gulch, and kind of our mindset when we were creating this battleground was like, let's make the opposite of Altrak Valley, a really small battleground, something that hopefully the matches could go quickly, and sometimes they do. Yeah. We began prototyping a lot earlier. With Altrak Valley, we got pretty deep into production before we started playing it. With Warsong Gulch, we were pretty much playing it in an empty field for a while before we were actually getting the map up and running. During prototyping, because we had this small battleground, we knew we wanted it to be a really tight battle. We thought capture the flag would be a really fun mechanic. A lot of us were old school Quake players, and we just, yeah. John Cash is the lead programmer on World of Warcraft. You guys know who he is? id Software, like Quake 2, he was the man. Anyway. Symmetrical bases. It was really important from what we learned from Altrak Valley, as cool as we thought our different bases were, we wanted to have symmetrical bases in Warsong Gulch. And we actually have a level designer on the World of Warcraft team. His name's John Statz. He's an amazing level designer. He had worked on a lot of Quake mods before coming to Blizzard, and he's the guy who designed and built our bases for Warsong Gulch. So he was an old school CTF player and mod maker who was building those bases. And a lot of thought was put into the base design, and that was by John more than anyone. After prototyping, we wanted to fit Warsong Gulch into the game world, and by that I mean we didn't want to just plop a CTF map in the game with no meaning, so we really developed the Silverwing Sentinels and the Warsong Outriders, and we positioned the map on the border of the Barrens and Ashenvale where there was a direct Horde Alliance conflict happening. So the next battleground we worked on, and I had mentioned this at the last BlizzCon, was actually called the Gurubashi Catacombs. And this was a pretty crazy map. Our thought at the time was capture the flag was really cool. Let's try a deathmatch map. It was going to be 5 versus 5, single elimination format. Sounds kind of familiar, huh? It was really early on we put it into prototyping, and here's a picture of the map. It's like horribly ugly because we just placed a lot of geometry down and we didn't really texture it properly. And this was actually our like Gurubashi Catacomb playtest where we tried it out. The map actually has a whole second level to it. It was just massive, and that was one of the lessons that we learned from the playtest. The objectives were absolutely key. We found that in a battleground, you really as a team want to drive towards some objective. The killing of the other player just sort of comes as a natural thing, as obtaining that objective, but it wasn't a satisfying objective on its own. We thought arenas sounded like a cool feature, but battlegrounds would play differently. And Tom and I in our last BlizzCon panel had sort of hinted that we really like this idea of arenas, and that's how the arena system sort of evolved. Arena maps need to be small. That was the other big lesson. And you've seen that in our arena map design, where we try to bring things in as much as possible. So then came Arathi Basin. This was kind of an interesting one because it was kind of getting back to the roots of what our original Battleground philosophy, like Tom told you about, which was Warcraft 3 meets Battlefield 1942. So we wanted those iconic Warcraft 3 points of interest, but we also wanted some of that 1942 gameplay of capture point control and team base. We also wanted to reward the people who weren't necessarily winning, also known as the losers. We wanted lots of players in the battleground, but we wanted it to be accessible to everyone. And by accessible, I mean you know what to do right when you show up to the battleground. You don't have to sort of research, what do the War Masters do? Who are the Sky Commanders? How do I make Ivar spawn? All that kind of stuff. And the whole goal was a very simple design. And this is my map that everybody calls the Atari map. This was the Arathi Basin design map, which is, and we stayed pretty true to it. You can see all the points of interest there. Spread people out, that was the top goal. We found an AV, everybody was clumping up. We were also running into Warsong Gulch issues of, the 10-on-10 teams just kind of going at it. So Arathi Basin was really designed to spread people out. And then we wanted really clear points of interest. And by that I mean the farm is just called the farm, the blacksmith. As soon as you say get to lumber mill, people know where you're talking about. So just really clear points of interest. And here's how an early design prototype of Arathi Basin, where the very first thing that we laid out was making sure that from each point of interest you could see at least 2, if not 3 or 4 other points of interest, just to have those really clear sight lines so you could see people across the map. So that was Arathi Basin. And don't just reward the winners. Then with Burning Crusade, we decided to make Eye of the Storm. Our original concept for the battleground that was going to ship with our Outland expansion was to do a Hellfire Peninsula battleground. But at the time, we were working on a new zone called Netherstorm. We thought it was really cool, and we thought a lot of our ideas fit better in the Netherstorm environment than in the Hellfire environment. So we wanted an Outland-themed battleground, obviously. We wanted to put a spin on tried and true gameplay. We felt like Arathi Basin was working out really well, but we wanted to try a little bit something new on top of Arathi Basin. And so our original concept was that we would have 4 bases, just like we do in Eye of the Storm, and the 5th base would actually be on a floating piece of rock that would continually move in a circular fashion across the battleground, and eventually that circular rock would come in contact with all the other points of interest. So it would become this kind of moving, rotating gameplay. We worked on that for a little while, and we found that it really wasn't working out or playing like we thought it would. So instead we went to the flag in the middle concept. So we just kind of adapted our philosophy on that one. So the future of Battlegrounds, I'm going to hand you off back to Tom, and he's going to go into some of the things that I brought up earlier, talk about some of the solutions to those problems.
All right, so as we mentioned earlier, we've got quite a few things coming for Battlegrounds. First off, we've got a slew of different Altrak Valley improvements, namely some improvements to kind of the flow of respawn. One of the things we're going to do is players won't respawn in their starting tunnels anymore until there's nowhere else to spawn. One of the things that that's intended to do is it's actually intended to encourage players that have kind of gotten beaten back to play some defense. The location of the Alliance tunnel right now actually does encourage Alliance players to play some defense, because if they're respawning there, they kind of flow naturally right back into Stormpike Graveyard. Whereas the Horde tunnel right now, if you get sent there, you're not really encouraged at all to go back and play some defense. You're encouraged to try to work your way back to the front of the map. In addition, we have some other improvements there. We're going to be evening out some of the NPCs. Yeah. And also, we have some anti-FK measures coming in. I'll talk a little bit how that's going to work. So with Altrak Valley, obviously we see a lot of issues where players find it's actually very effective to sit there and be AFK in the battleground. Unfortunately, this is kind of, to some degree, natural consequence of the size of the battleground. Once you're only one of 40 people, you kind of feel a little bit more anonymous. You feel like you can sort of get away with sitting there in the tunnel not doing anything. It has to do with the fact that you start off in a very safe area inside that tunnel, so it's pretty safe to not get killed by other players, etc. There are a lot of different contributing factors, the way the honors distributed, and some other measures. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually give the players ability to report other players for being AFK, and sort of in the same way that you can report spam. You'll be able to pop up the map, you'll be able to right-click on somebody's dot on the map and say, report AFK. Once enough players have reported that person for AFK, then a debuff countdown is going to start on that player. And if they don't get into combat before it expires, they get another debuff that stops their honor gain until they get into combat. So if you are actually playing the game for whatever reason, then all you have to do is you get into combat, and the debuff goes away, all those reports get set to 0, and you can go about your business and keep gaining honor. But for people that are sitting in there doing absolutely nothing, they'll get reported and they'll stop gaining any honor. So hopefully that should make it so that there really isn't a very strong incentive to do that, because you'll just get nailed with being AFK and then you don't get anything out of it. So in addition, we're going to be doing some honor distribution and balance improvements. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the issues with Altrak Valley is you get a lot of honor just for being there in the early process when some of those early named NPCs are dying. We're going to actually planning to shift some of that honor gain to later parts of the battleground that more highly encourage you to actually win. And finally, we have some queue improvements for Battlegrounds in general in mind. Not only would we like to once again introduce queuing as a group for Altrak Valley, but we'd also like to continue to kind of refine the way the queue works, because right now we're very limited in terms of the number of different battlegrounds that we can add to the world of Warcraft, because as it stands, each battleground that we add spreads people out more and more among the different battlegrounds. And what's really important is we need to have critical mass for any given battleground to make sure that we can do all of our matchmaking. We want to be able to put the pre-mades up against other pre-mades more often. We want to be able to put the pugs up against pugs. So we've got to keep that critical mass. And the way the queue system's set up right now, it's not really set up to handle that. So one of the things that we've been considering right now, and this isn't something that is necessarily guaranteed to happen, but one of the things we're talking about is going toward more of a model where you pick the size of battleground you want to participate in. So let's say I want to participate in a 15 on 15 or a 10 on 10, etc. And then it'll put you into any one of the different 15 on 15 battlegrounds rather than actually selecting a specific battleground. Because that would allow us to add in unlimited number of 15 on 15 battlegrounds, but everybody's in the queue for all those at a given time. It wouldn't dilute the population. Another thing we're very interested in doing is adding the concept of guild battlegrounds. And what I mean by that, there's been a lot of interest expressed over the years in terms of guilds being able to challenge each other and fight each other. So what we'd like to do is add this concept of being able to join the battleground, as a guild, and potentially have your guild have a rating for the battlegrounds. So it's sort of in the same kind of mechanic as the arena system. Your guild be able to hold a rating for a battleground and improve that rating by winning, and lose rating by losing, and potentially be able to gain some interesting new rewards and new perks, new benefits for your guild by having your guild do well in the guild battlegrounds. And of course, we plan to have some siege weapons and destroyable buildings. So this being one of our key features for Wrath of the Lich King, it makes sense, of course, to have a battleground that features that kind of gameplay. We've also tossed around the idea of incorporating that sort of gameplay into other battlegrounds like Altrak Valley. Not sure whether or not that in particular is going to happen, but it is something that we've been talking about. But we do know that we will be adding a new battleground that is really focused around siege weapons and destroyable buildings. You'll get in there, should be pretty fast paced, you'll get your siege weapons, you'll be able to blow up enemy buildings, you'll be able to shoot at other players with your siege weapons. We're planning on having siege weapons that function differently for the different kind of racial styles. So for example, the undead meat wagon that throws corpses might actually do more damage to areas of players versus the catapult that's throwing a giant boulder, which might do better against certain types of buildings. So next what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about our world PvP philosophy. So like I mentioned, we have these three different major areas of PvP. We've got battlegrounds, we've got world PvP, and we've got arenas. So world PvP is intended to be a focus for spontaneous PvP. Obviously world PvP happens on its own on just about any PvP server when somebody's trying to do a quest and some other guy comes up and tries to jack him while he's doing it. But that isn't really the kind of world PvP that we're talking about here. The PvP that we're talking about here is giving players outdoor world objectives that have some consequence and some feeling of meaning in the game world as a whole. So again, even world PvP, a lot like Battlegrounds, should be objective driven. It shouldn't just be random. And it should also reward participation. So unlike Battlegrounds, it shouldn't be as much oriented around winning or losing, because as game designers, we have far less control over who actually shows up for world PvP. I really, as the game designer, have no clue whether or not 15 Alliance and 10 Horde are going to show up, or whether 40 Horde are going to show up and 10 Alliance. So we want to make sure that you don't come away with nothing if you happen to be on the team that loses. This is why, in a lot of cases, the existing PvP outdoor mechanics that we have, you get like your Hala battle tokens, etc., just for having gotten kills, even if you don't actually succeed in defending Hala or taking it over. In addition, one of the really core points is that world PvP should affect the world in some way or another. I think that one of the major things players like to see with their world PvP is they want to have a feeling that it has some kind of impact, like capturing Hala had some sort of impact because now you have the advantages of having that town, or taking over the spirit towers around Auchindoun, how that gives your team an advantage because now you get spirit shards off the Auchindoun bosses. So some of the things we've learned from all the different world PvP things that we've tried out, we've got our first example, Silithus. One of the things we learned from that is that it has to feel compelling, right? It can't just be contrived sort of gameplay that is sort of tacked onto an existing zone. We need to make sure that the PvP gameplay there feels like it's substantive. It's got to feel like it makes sense to the players. Something we learned from Eastern Plaguelands is that the reward has to feel meaningful. A lot of players say that when they took over the towers in Eastern Plaguelands, it didn't really feel very meaningful because you just get this kind of, modest buff to what you were doing in Eastern Plaguelands, and there really wasn't that much kind of endgame activity at the time going on in Eastern Plaguelands itself. So kind of players really sort of asked, well, I did the event, and it was kind of interesting and all that, but really what did it matter? Hellfire Peninsula, what we learned there is that pacing is very important. Hellfire Peninsula just kind of goes on and on and on and on and never really ends. It's important for players to feel like they've established some sort of outcome and there's some sort of persistent result. And Zangar Marsh, what we learned from that is that clarity is really important. We've got to make sure that players understand how the PvP objectives work. And Zangar Marsh is a little bit too obfuscated for a lot of people to instantly get as soon as they get into the zone. They don't know exactly how it works. And the Bone Waste, the Terakar Spirit Towers, the Spirit Towers around Akendune, what we learned there was actually something that we really want to apply in the future. It's actually, we learned that something worked very well, which is that 6-hour capture time. That once you actually take that over, that it gives your team a benefit for the next 6 hours. We really feel like that's a pretty solid model to build on for the future. And in Nagrand with Hala, what we learned there is that it works really well when the PvP is integrated very tightly into the map. So with that, I'd like to talk some about the future world PvP. And the central focus of that is with Lake Wintergrass. As I talked about a little bit in the Wrath of the Lich King panel, we're adding an entirely new zone to Northrend that is just going to be based around PvP. It's a very central zone, and anybody that goes into that zone, even on a PvE server, will be flagged for PvP. And once you're in that zone, you'll be able to participate with siege weapons, destroyable buildings, etc. So we're going to be doing a few things to make sure that that plays out very well and kind of incorporate all those different lessons. We want to make sure we spread players out by having multiple objectives within Lake Wintergrass so that not 300 players aren't clumping together in the same spot and dragging everybody's frame rate down. We're going to try to make sure that there's a persistent effect that affects all of Northrend, so that once your team successfully captures Lake Wintergrass, that there's some kind of meaningful effect on the rest of the kind of game content. So hopefully all these different things combined will kind of really bump up the feeling, how compelling the world PvP is in general, and how integrated it feels into the rest of the game as a whole. So with that, I'd like to go on and talk about arenas. So arenas in the World of Warcraft were created really with the idea of competition in mind. We, up to before the Burning Crusade, we felt like we had the honor system, which was now kind of like what you could call a grind system, where you could slowly but surely work your way towards certain rewards. But we really wanted to make sure there was an area of the game where you could express skill as much as possible. So along those lines, we decided to go ahead and go with a rating system because we wanted to make sure that, unlike in a battleground, your losses would count against you. Because we knew with an arena, you'd be forming a team and you're very much in control of what your team does. You don't have to queue with your team if you don't want to, and if you guys are very much in control of whether or not you're going to play, you're very in control of whether or not your rating has the opportunity to go up or down. Unlike with a battleground where you can join as an individual and kind of get put into a pug, etc. In addition, we want the arena system to have a feeling of steady progress, and this is why the arena ratings translate into points at the end of each week, or on Tuesday of each week. Something that we found is that a rating system on its very own, if used without any other kind of supporting feature like the arena points that you get from it each week, actually encourages players to play as little as possible to protect their ratings. So we wanted to have something where we would make sure that players felt like they were encouraged, that each week they'd have to get out there and defend their rating and continue to take advantage of it if they wanted to get the points from it. And so those points are the feeling of steady progress that you get, getting those points every week towards some really awesome stuff. In addition, as Jeff mentioned earlier, we learned that we really wanted to use small, simple maps for the arenas. Something that we tried to do at first with Gurubashi Catacombs was try a bigger map with a 5-on-5 environment, and that really didn't work out because you spend too much time just trying to find your opponents. In addition, we want random map selection. We wanted to make sure we stayed out of that trap that we fell into with the Battlegrounds, where the more we added, the more diluted the players become. And that's why the arena system uses the random maps. We know that you queue up for your certain format size, you queue up either for 2-on-3, 2, 3-on-3, or 5-on-5, And because of that, we can put you in, we can create any number of arena maps that we want just to make sure that it feels kind of new and fresh without having to worry about diluting everybody. Finally, we wanted to make sure there was no discrimination between Alliance and Horde. We felt like since Arena has that kind of, that vibe and that feel of being a sport, and not as much the feel of being a war between the Horde and Alliance, we felt like this was really the appropriate place to make sure that Horde could play against other Horde, Alliance could play against other Alliance. That's beneficial for reasons for the queue. It means that everybody's in the same queue so that you don't have queues that are longer for one side than the other. It's also beneficial because it gives players in the same team an ability to kind of face off against each other. You know, as we know right now in Battlegrounds, Horde guild can't fight against another Horde guild, so it's really hard for them to kind of prove, you know, who the better guild is. So here are some of the things that we've learned from the arena system. Number one, it's really difficult to balance for a lot of different formats. A lot of the classes really behave very differently across the different formats. As we've seen, you know, Warlocks are very strong dueling class, and also because of that, they're very strong in the smaller formats like 2-on-2. As the format gets bigger, they become better and better balanced, if you call it. Like in 5-on-5, they don't tend to be a dominant class. They really kind of fall in with the, you know, kind of average other classes. And that continues to be true as they scale up into the size of Battlegrounds, etc. Some other classes face the opposite problem. For example, warriors don't tend to be very good in the smaller formats unless they happen to be paired up with a paladin. They tend to have a lot more difficult time because of that. So it can be really tricky for us to balance for all these different formats at the same time as balancing for things such as, you know, raid PvE, group PvE, you know, heroics, non-heroics, etc. But we're still trying. Another thing we've learned is that we should avoid map gimmicks. Something we started off with was in the Nagrand Arena. You guys, I think, might remember the cyclones that we had going on there. And even though early on in the development of the map, we realized that random elements would be a bad thing in an arena map, we made the cyclones predictable. They always spawned in at the exact same time after the battleground started. They always followed the exact same pattern. And the hope was that expert players would kind of learn those spawn times, learn those patterns, and be able to take advantage of the cyclone unlike others. However, as it turns out, our PvP is kind of crazy enough, it's frenetic enough, it's hectic enough, that we didn't really need to introduce that additional element to make sure that it stayed interesting and complex. There really is enough room for skilled players to express their skill against other players without the need for map gimmicks. So that's why those cyclones are gone. In addition, something else that we found that we're going to be addressing with Season 3, Travis alluded to the last panel, was that one of the things players have found is that the weapons, because they aren't as clearly distinguished against PvE gear as the armor is, obviously the PvP armor has so much resilience on it that it's very clearly distinguished against the raid gear. However, the weapons don't really have that, because most of what you care about a weapon for is the amount of damage it's going to add to your character. So one of the things we found is that a lot of the players that engage in raid content feel very compelled to do some arenas just to get their kind of free weapon at the end of each season or at the beginning of the next season. So one of the things that we're planning on doing to make sure that the weapon feels like this really kind of epic reward that you get out of the arena system for being a real badass is we're going to make sure that there's a rating requirement, rating, R-A-T-I-N-G, not rating. There's going to be a rating requirement for weapons for the Season 3 weapons. So you will have to achieve a certain rating. Don't know exactly what that rating will be, maybe around 1900 or so before you're eligible to buy the weapon. So that brings us to our Q&A session.